Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We have a really special event in store. I'm just going to give folks a minute or two to join. We'll get started around 2 past the hour, so just a minute. We'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lauren Harper, and I have the honor of serving as Freedom of the Press Foundation's inaugural Daniel Ellsberg Chair on Government Secrecy. This was a position that was created to honor the legacy and continue the work of the legendary Daniel Ellsberg, who, among other accolades, released the Pentagon Papers, fought tirelessly against government secrecy, and of course, co-founded Freedom of the Press Foundation. So it's my great privilege to be able to introduce today's event, which is sponsored both by Freedom of the Press Foundation and Defending Rights in Dissent. FPF is a nonprofit that defends and empowers public interest journalism. We advocate for the press and the public's right to know, build secure communication tools, teach journalists how to keep themselves and their sources safe in the digital age, and manage the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, which monitors and documents virtually every press freedom violation in the U.S. Defending Rights in Dissent is a national civil liberties organization that defends the American people's right to know and freedom to act through grassroots mobilization, public education, policy expertise, and advocacy journalism. You can check out FPF's work at freedom.press. And if you want to support our work, please visit freedom.press/donate. And you can check out DRAD's work at rightsinddissent.org and support their work at secure.rightsinddissent.org/a/donate. So today's event focuses on the need to reform the Espionage Act to stop abusive prosecutions of whistleblowers and journalists and the chilling effect those prosecutions bring. The bill that Representative Rashida Tlaib has introduced, the Daniel Ellsberg Press Freedom and Whistleblower Protection Act, will do just that. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists, starting with Representative Rashida Tlaib, representative from Michigan, a leading advocate for reform of the Espionage Act and sponsor of the Ellsberg Act. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We're also pleased to be joined by Robert Ellsberg, author, editor, and publisher, and the son of late Pentagon Papers whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg. Thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
Also joining us is Chip Gibbons, policy director at Defending Rights in Dissent and author of the forthcoming critical history of the FBI, the Imperial Bureau. Gibbons has advised members of Congress on reforming the Espionage Act, as well as reported on numerous Espionage Act prosecutions. And finally, Trevor Timm, co-founder and executive director of Freedom of the Press Foundation and longstanding advocate for Espionage Act reform. Thank you all so very much for your work and for being here. So to start, I'd like to pose my first question to Representative Tlaib. Could you tell us why you introduced this bill and what it will do?
Well, first of all, thank you so much to Defending Rights in Dissent and the Freedom of Press Foundation for your partnership and for organizing this event. And of course, special thank you to Robert Ellsberg for being here with us and honoring his father by working to protect future whistleblowers and journalists who carry on his courageous legacy. So we're introduced it this morning, the Daniel Ellsberg Press Freedom and Whistleblower Protection Act, because we need to rein in the Espionage Act. You guys know this. We must do it in order to prevent its use and abuse against whistleblowers, especially under fascist regimes. We already have seen, again, the continuation and push by the American public in exposing corruption within our government and wrongdoing. And more than ever, since the law became implemented in 1917, we know that the Espionage Act has been used to target and criminalize political dissent. And at this moment, at this time, it's not just ICE, it's not just a number of unlawful activity by the Trump administration, but more than ever, we're seeing even members of Congress enabling and allowing, again, the targeting of those that are expressing their First Amendment right. We're seeing more federal workers and others coming forward and trying to expose, again, the corruption, the abuse of power. And so more than ever in 2026, if there's any time to understand the importance of the Daniel Ellsberg Press Freedom and Whistleblower Protection Act, it is now.
Thank you. Couldn't agree more, and so well said. I'd like to ask Robert a question, if I may. Your father, who is one of the most famous people to have been charged under the Espionage Act, of course, for leaking the Pentagon Papers, spent years advocating for exactly the kind of reform that Representative Tlaib is introducing. And I'm wondering, what do you think would have been his reaction to seeing a bill bearing his name finally introduced? And what's your own reaction?
I think it's muted.
I think you might be muted, Robert.
Sorry. I think he would be delighted, as I am, that this bill is named after him. I don't know if that will help or impede its passage in Congress. But these are exactly the kinds of changes that he advocated for a long time. He himself, as you noted, was one of perhaps the first person charged under elements of the Espionage Act who was not accused of giving secrets to a foreign country or to an enemy of the United States, but to Congress, the press, and the American people. And he was facing 12 felony charges, 115 years in prison. Fortunately, he was not convicted because the charges were dismissed as a result of gross government misconduct, as it was called, that is to say, crimes. But he what concerned him in particular was that under the Espionage Act, as construed in his case, it's not possible to present an affirmative defense for why you were acting as a whistleblower or revealing confidential or secrets. And since then, the law has been used against many other whistleblowers, including Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden, charges at least, and Julian Assange, who all were acting, as my father deeply believed, in the interests of the American people to prevent crimes and violations of the Constitution, but would not be allowed in a courtroom to present a defense for why they had done this. So believing as he did in the extreme importance and value of whistleblowing in a democracy, especially given the prevalence of crimes that are concealed by secrecy and classification, he would have been very, very strongly in support of this bill.
Thank you for that. And we'll get into some of the specific fixes in Representative Tlaib's bill in just a moment. But I'm wondering, perhaps, Chip, you could walk us through a short history of the Espionage Act, maybe give us some background on the political context and what its original purpose was.
Sure. So the Espionage Act is passed in 1917 in the middle of World War I. President Woodrow Wilson had campaigned. He had kept us out of the war. And then when he was reelected, he got us into the war. And many Americans did not think we should be in World War I. I know this is very hard for us to imagine a president campaigning on no more wars and then getting us into more wars against the American people. But let's use our imagination some to think back what the time must have been like. We've never seen anything like that since, and certainly not now. And the Espionage Act was passed to deal with the fact that there was a lot of opposition to the war from a variety of spheres. And the law was originally used to prosecute people for basically pure speech. People were sent to jail for saying things like, Woodrow Wilson is a Wall Street tool. I am for the people, the government's for the profiters. And famously, Eugene Debs was prosecuted for saying throughout history, I'm paraphrasing, that history wars have been started by the master class and fought by the servant class. Why not let the people decide if war is right or wrong? Again, things that echo today as we have a very unpopular war against Iran that has not been approved by Congress. And we see lots of dissent. For a number of reasons, this type of use of the Espionage Act became no longer legally feasible, in part because a section of it called the Sedition Act was repealed, as well as because courts changed the way in which they were willing to apply liability for speech. I won't go too far into that. But another provision of the Espionage Act, the provision governing the communication of national defense information, starts to take on a life of its own during the Cold War as a means for once again censoring dissenting views on foreign policy. Dan Ellsberg, who the bill is named after, began as a government insider who believed in the Cold War, but he came to believe the Vietnam War was not just a mistake, it was a crime. And inspired by sort of war resistors, he chose to copy the Pentagon Papers, which was a secret history of the Vietnam War that showed the government was lying to the people, and give them to the New York Times. The Nixon administration used the Espionage Act to try to do two things. First, they tried to prevent the New York Times from publishing stories based on the Pentagon Papers in advance. And second, they indicted Dan Ellsberg and Anthony Russo for being the sources. The Supreme Court stopped Nixon from gagging the New York Times, but was silent on whether or not you could prosecute them after publication. And then Dan's case fell apart, not because of the serious constitutional questions, but because of the Nixon administration, the FBI's rampant criminality. The Espionage Act sat as a loaded gun rarely used until, unfortunately, the Obama years, when it became the go-to weapon against whistleblowers exposing the war on terror. So people like Thomas Drake or Edward Snowden, who exposed misconduct, including illegal surveillance of Americans at the NSA, were charged under it. John Kiriakou, who exposed the torture program, was charged under it. Defending Rights and Dissent board member Jeffrey Sterling, who was accused and maintains his innocence of giving information to James Risen, a reporter, about a botched CIA covert action against Iran, was convicted under it. And then we also see, of course, Chelsea Manning convicted under it for exposing information about war crimes to WikiLeaks. And this really sets off a fanatical obsession by multiple wings of the US government against WikiLeaks, with an intent not just to get Manning the source, but to go against Assange, the journalist and publisher who brought those revelations to the people. The Obama administration, for its many faults, resisted pressure from both the FBI and the CIA to charge Julian Assange or to go after him more harshly. When Trump becomes president, he not only continues prosecutions of whistleblowers, Terry Albury, Daniel Hale, Reality Winner, he brings the prosecution against Julian Assange, which is largely a dusting off of, I suspect, legal theories that were concocted during the Obama years. And it's really an unprecedented moment to see a journalist or publisher, whichever one to classify Julian Assange as, prosecuted for truthful reporting. And, you know, when Biden comes in, a lot of people, including one of the national security prosecutors on the case, thought they would drop it. Instead, they continue to go through this horrific extradition process in the United Kingdom, which I observed parts of. And actually, the British lawyers for the US government at one point tell them their arguments are unethical, which sort of tanks the case. And then eventually Assange is coerced into a plea deal for conspiracy to violate the Espionage Act, which treats the relationship between Assange, the journalist, and Manning, the source, as a criminal conspiracy.
Thank you, Chip. I want to dig into some of that a little bit more, but I'd like to take this opportunity to bring Trevor into the conversation. Trevor, could you elaborate a little bit more, not only on how the Espionage Act has been abused, but any specific risks that journalists face of prosecution under the Espionage Act?
Yeah, you know, I think as a couple of panelists have already pointed out, when ordinary people who never heard of the Espionage Act hear the phrase Espionage Act, they think, oh, this must be about spies or somebody selling secrets to the foreign government. And it's actually why Congress has never actually tackled this issue in any real way, because when people hear the Espionage Act, they aren't thinking about journalism, they aren't thinking about press freedom, they aren't thinking about whistleblowers. So I do just want to commend Representative Tlaib's political bravery here, because this is probably one of the most unjust, if not the most unjust laws in the entire US code. And why I say that is because literally it is impossible for whistleblowers to get a fair trial. You would think when you're a whistleblower and you go to a journalist and you expose waste, fraud, and abuse or government wrongdoing or illegality, that you would have your day in court. You would be able to tell your side of the story. But as Daniel Ellsberg found out and others have found out after him, it couldn't be farther from the truth. So, for example, if you are charged under the Espionage Act for giving information to a journalist out of your patriotic duty, you are not allowed to tell the jury that the information that you gave them exposed government misconduct. You're not allowed to tell the jury that your disclosure did not actually harm national security. All of this is inadmissible. You are not allowed to talk to the jury about overclassification or talk about how this shouldn't have been secret in the first place. And you are not allowed to even tell a jury why you did what you did. Of course, the big difference between being a spy and being a whistleblower is you are exercising your patriotic duty to inform the American public versus literally selling secrets to a foreign government. And, this is a right that even alleged murderers have in court, yet anybody charged under the Espionage Act does not. And so really it is an automatic go to jail card if you were ever charged under this law. And that's, in the land of the First Amendment, that is just incredibly unjust. And so defendant after defendant basically has no way of defending themselves. And so the past few administrations have figured out, actually, this is a great way to increase government secrecy even further. We can go after these sources, and there's basically nothing they can do if we catch them in the act. Journalists have to worry too, of course, because this law is written so broadly that at least if you focus only on the letter of the law and not the Constitution, not only is every national security journalist in the United States guilty of this law virtually every day, but everybody who reads the newspaper, who is holding the physical paper in their hand or it's on their computer, because so much of the national security and foreign policy worlds are classified. There's classified information in the newspaper almost every day. And just by possessing stories in the New York Times or Washington Post, you are arguably violating this law. Now, it's our view and many legal scholars' view that this should be blatantly unconstitutional. Unfortunately, the government has come closer and closer to being able to go after journalists whenever they want. In addition to the WikiLeaks case that Chip mentioned, we have to realize that a Washington Post reporter's home was just raided 2 months ago with the government citing the Espionage Act as a reason. And we've seen articles in multiple media organizations talking about how the Trump administration wants to use the Espionage Act against journalists. So it is, not just a loaded gun. It is a loaded army that is facing journalists and whistleblowers right now. And so this bill could not have come at a better time.
Absolutely agreed. And I've got a question for Representative Tlaib, but really quickly, because Chip mentioned Julian Assange, I wanted to get some clarification on something. So Julian Assange, a publisher prosecuted under the Espionage Act, at the time, prosecutors said that was different from prosecuting a journalist. One, is that true? And two, are there any restrictions that would prevent an Espionage Act prosecution of a journalist? Or does the law need to be completely overhauled for that to happen? And I open the floor to anybody who would like to address that.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in, whether you think Julian Assange is a journalist or not. I know that's a contentious issue in the United States, although in most of the rest of the world, he's considered a journalist. It doesn't matter because the conduct described in the indictment is conduct that journalists routinely engage in. There were two sorts of forms of legal liability they went after Assange under. One was the pure publication theory, that there were, I think, 3 charges that were exclusively these documents were classified and he published them. The rest of the charges against him were using either conspiracy liability or aiding and abetting liability. And this is also a big fear because it turns the journalist-source relationship into a criminal conspiracy. So the conspiracy that Assange pled guilty to was he conspired with Chelsea Manning. Chelsea Manning took information she wasn't supposed to have. That's count 1 of the conspiracy. She gave it to Julian Assange, who wasn't supposed to have it. He then kept it and published it on WikiLeaks. So that is describing a source giving a journalist information. Under that legal theory, any journalist anywhere in this country who gets classified information from a source has broken the Espionage Act. And if the government had gone further and kept the pure publication charges in play for the plea deal, that would have meant that, the New York Times, just by printing the paper. As Trevor pointed out, the Espionage Act is extremely broad. There's been questions during legal proceedings from judges about whether or not the government believes that sharing a New York Times article on Twitter X. I'm not going to call it, that's just Twitter. On Twitter constitutes, violating the Espionage Act. So there are serious threats to journalists. And I will also note that even when the journalist is not charged, it opens the door to surveillance of them. So the Washington Post reporter is not yet at least charged under the Espionage Act, but because they're gathering information on her source, they were able to raid her house. This happened with James Risen. The government accused our board member, Jeffrey Sterling, of being his source. Sterling to this day denies that. And as a result, they were able to surveil Risen, and they wanted to be able to force him to testify under oath about his source. So the Espionage Act creates liability for pure publication. It criminalizes the journalist-source relationship, and it opens up the door to surveillance of journalists, even if they're not formally charged.
Very well said. And some of the stuff that you spoke about is a perfect segue for my next question for Representative Tlaib. You've been fighting for fixes to the Espionage Act for years. This is not your first time introducing a bill or an amendment to rein in the law. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what first got you interested in tackling the Espionage Act and why it's especially important right now, not just given, who's in the White House, but also the government's growing surveillance capabilities. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that. I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I think it's funny because Chip was talking, I was talking, I was like, can he hear me? I think it's really important to know that it's not just the current administration, but we've seen Democratic administrations as well abuse this act. But I think today, as we all see, our government is committing horrific war crimes and crimes against humanity, from Iran now to Palestine to Cuba, while expanding mass surveillance and spying on Americans more than ever before. And I just want folks, you don't have to be a whistleblower or journalist to care about the fact that we need to be able to rein in the Espionage Act, need to realize much of what is being used there is pushing back against the right to dissent and the right for us to have the information shared to the public, especially exposing lies and mistruths. Exposing the truth, alerting the public to the government wrongdoing is not a crime and should never be a crime. So again, even though we have a lot of courageous people that are coming forward, even the example of the first person it was used against, they were literally in prison for a speech. But again, a lot of what is happening now, I think the serious human rights abuses across our world and the role that our government is playing, from Democratic administrations to now Republican administrations, we have seen again the importance of pushing back against this. For me and many of us, I've always wanted to be a journalist, by the way, because I always wanted to expose the truth. Now I'm doing it as a member of Congress. But I think in many ways people only see that. But what we've seen in my office and our team, and even movement work, is even whistleblowers within the government are being targeted in a way that is suppressing. It's historically, again, Espionage Act has been used to be able to suppress so much, tool of repression, a tool to wage, illegal actions domestically and, abroad. And so it's more now than ever to rein in this dangerous unconstitutional power. And it is a tremendous amount of power that, again, needs to be reined in, no matter who is president.
Absolutely, no matter who is president, indeed. This next question is for Robert and touches on something that Representative Tlaib mentioned. Your father was charged with leaking information about the government's lies regarding the Vietnam War. Today, we are on the threshold, perhaps passing this threshold, of a long-term war in Iran. Could you talk about why the Espionage Act is so dangerous, particularly during wartime?
Well, my father had signed many security agreements in his career. When he was a Marine, when he worked for the RAND Corporation as a defense analyst, when he worked for the Pentagon. And he said he'd never actually asked himself, does this mean that what if it's a matter of keeping a secret about crimes or about violations of the Constitution, which he was also obligated under oath to protect and defend? What if it meant murder and the mass death, as it did in the case of Vietnam? He felt he was prepared to go to prison, and he believed that he was doing this, releasing the Pentagon Papers in a spirit of civil disobedience. But he was kind of surprised as his lawyers looked over the law and realized that there really wasn't any precedent for this kind of a prosecution under the Espionage Act. He said, gee, well, that's good. That means I'll be acquitted, right? And they said, well, you've got to admit that releasing 7,000 pages of top secret documents to the press sounds kind of bad. And he often said, later on, that he wishes he had revealed secrets earlier when he was aware, as early as 1965 in the Tonkin Gulf incident, that we were being lied into a war. If he had released information that was available to him at that time, who knows if that might not have saved a countless number of American and Vietnamese lives. So he always would say, don't do what I did. Don't wait years after the bombs have been falling. Don't even wait necessarily until these plans have been set in motion. If you were aware, if you have access to information that would save lives, that Congress and the American people have a democratic right to be informed about, you should do that. Now, understanding, though, that entails a great deal of risk, and particularly in an environment where it's impossible to say what has motivated you, why you have done this. John Kerry, Secretary of State, with regard to Edward Snowden, said he ought to man up and just come back and go to court and defend himself. My father pointed out that's ridiculous. He would not have any opportunity to defend himself or to explain why he did this. In fact, he would probably be held incommunicado in a supermax prison, awaiting his trial and after his likely conviction. So he felt it was a very different situation even that he faced back in 1971, 72, when he was released on a $50,000 bond and was able to travel around the country speaking around the war and raising money for his defense. Anyway, there could be no other circumstances, I think, that would more merit truth-telling and whistleblowing than revealing secrets that could save lives and prevent a war.
Absolutely. Before moving on to some of the specific fixes in the bill, I was wondering if either perhaps Chip or Trevor could really clarify, does the Espionage Act, as it's currently written, give any protection to whistleblowers who disclose information that's in the public interest?
Well, that's what I was referring to before. There is no public interest defense in the Espionage Act. And so what that means is that you essentially can't say anything to a jury that could tell them about your motive, that could say that this doesn't actually harm national security, that there's a public benefit to it, that this shouldn't be classified in the first place. So there is no way for you to even bring that up in a courtroom. All of that is decided before the jury even gets there. And in all the cases, unfortunately, judges have ruled, no, this is inadmissible. So what it essentially means is it doesn't matter what was in the document. It doesn't matter what the document did. It doesn't matter what your motive for giving the document to the journalist is. If you gave it to him, you go directly to jail. And so that's meant for a lot of these brave whistleblowers that they can't even go to trial because there's nothing for them to say at trial. And so they're forced to plead guilty and go to jail, even though they still believe to this day that they did the right thing.
And if I could just add one quick thing, it's not just that the law doesn't give a public interest defense. I mean, that's a huge part of it. The law makes no distinction between a spy, a whistleblower, a disgruntled government employee, a journalist, a publisher, or as Trevor has pointed out, someone holding a newspaper, right? It lumps all of these people together into one category and is a blanket prohibition on disclosing national defense information, a term the law doesn't even define, right? We generally think it means classified information, but the law predates classification.
Right, absolutely. Now, moving on to what the Ellsberg Act would actually do. Representative Tlaib, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the bill's specific fixes, how the public would directly benefit it, not just whistleblowers, of course, the public who benefit from whistleblowers' disclosures. Chip, maybe you could tackle that.
Did she just leave, or?
It looks like she did. Yes, Chip, would you mind taking that question?
Yeah, I think she put a comment in the chat from Tlaib. It would dramatically increase the protections for whistleblowers by increasing due process standards and safeguards, granting the whistleblowers the right to give an affirmative public interest defense, and requiring the government to prove they act with specific intent to harm the United States or benefit a foreign power. I think one of the really strong parts the law does is it also distinguishes between the general public and those with a duty to protect class information. So a journalist, a person with a newspaper, a publisher could not be charged under it. And then those with the duty to protect class information, the government has to prove that they intended to harm the U.S. or that they use, and they also have a public interest defense and a right to testify themselves. Is Representative Tlaib returning, or do we know here?
I am not sure. It looks like we're not sure. So Chip, if you want to continue talking about some of the bill's specific fixes, I was also wondering. Yeah, go ahead and continue. And I have a follow-up question for you as well. I'm wondering if you have any indication about how members of the intelligence community, or veterans might feel about changes coming to the Espionage Act.
Yes. So we sent a letter to the Congress signed by a number of intelligence professionals, as well as veterans, including Colonel Lawrence. Oh, are you back? Let's let Representative Tlaib speak. Representative Tlaib speak.
No, sorry, Chip. Chip actually led the effort in drafting. I'm so sorry. Something happened on my laptop and I moved back over here. I think what everyone has said is exactly what it does, is the overreach and kind of reining him back in. So it's very specific and not so broad. But it also, ironically, again, I think Chip and others have explained that there is no due process right now. Daniel Ellsberg couldn't defend himself. He couldn't push back. It's kind of the same as what we saw in the use of secret evidence in detaining Americans in our country. I saw that in the late 80s and 90s, throughout 90s, that people were doing that. And so it does that specifically. And also, I think really importantly, and I know Chip mentioned it as well, is the way the due process works, but also in the way it protects folks from not allowing it to say, oh, is it public interest? Is it not? And being very specific, and again, narrowing it so that it is not as broad. And again, it's not just people think right now, and they're kind of paying attention of the Espionage Act because of who is president, but no, in times of war, they really use this to abuse and again, push back against dissent, or those that are pushing back against, again, some of the lies and mistruths and corruption within the government, and not only the Pentagon, we've seen it in a number of other agencies. And so I think it's important to realize, again, why it's important to bring in the scope of it and be able to, again, allow there to be a public and more transparent process than what I think has been allowed under the law.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Chip, could we return to you and sort of what you were saying about any indications that you've received about how members of the intelligence community, veterans, et cetera, feel about hopefully coming to reform to the Espionage Act?
So everyone on the Hill received, or every office on the Hill received a letter signed by a number of armed forces veterans, as well as former members of the U.S. intelligence community supporting Tlaib's bill, supporting the Dan Ellsberg Act. This includes Lawrence Wilkerson, who was Colin Powell's former chief of staff during the run-up to the Iraq War, and is very repentant for what has happened and has warned us about the cost of another war in Iran. It includes Thomas Drake, a NSA whistleblower who was the signature Espionage Act prosecution under the Obama years. It includes our board member, Jeffrey Sterling, and John Kiriakou, also prosecuted under the Espionage Act. And it includes former U.S. Marine Captain and State Department officer Matthew Ho, who had resigned in protest over the Afghan war. And I know Lisa Ling and a number of the drone whistleblowers on there who feel very constricted in what they can say about the drone program because of the Espionage Act. These are people who we've worked with who want to come forward and tell the people about the drone program and have told some things, but are aware they're very limited and gagged in what they can say. So as the intelligence professionals and veterans said, the founding of our republic is based on the consent of the governed. When the government makes war or spies on its own people in secret and seeks to use the threat of criminal prosecution to maintain that secrecy, that core principle is severely undermined. The Espionage Act must be reformed, not only because it is intolerable that patriotic public servants acting in good faith are prosecuted as though they were spies, but because it is a serious threat to our democracy. And there's a copy of that letter on rightsandDissent.org if you'd like to read it for yourself.
Thank you, Chip. Another question for Representative Tlaib. I think a question that might be asked is, do people need to worry that reforming the law along the way the Ellsberg Act prescribes will somehow make it more difficult to prosecute real spies for committing actual Espionage Act? Is there a concern there that is founded or no?
Absolutely not. There are current laws in place to be able to target those that might be spying on our government. I think in many cases, we have not actually seen this law being applied in a way that I think that was the goal of it. But I would urge American people that are looking at this to understand this would not, if anything, it prevents the abuse of it being applied to folks that are not spies, but our journalists, our people that work for our government, whistleblowers, people that are objecting, again, many of which are Americans, many of which are folks that might want to be able to come forward and not be able to be pushed back by this president or any previous presidents in regards to time of war, time where you've seen fascist, approach in government decisions that we see currently now. And I think, people always say to me, oh, well, there's no law for this. Yes, there is. Sometimes there's over 50 different kinds of ways. And I've seen it particularly around charging folks for white supremacy, terrorist acts, and things of that nature. It's already current law. We don't need new laws. If anything, we need to pay attention to see how these laws are applied, because the intent here was not to, and maybe it was at the time, but it was not intended, I think, by the American people to support something that would target, again, folks that are trying to protect us and trying to save lives.
This question, I think, might be a good fit for Trevor. Why should both Democrats and Republicans and independents support this bill?
Well, Democrats, Republicans, and independents all, at least when they're out of power, claim that they support government transparency. And we have seen over the past 40 or 50 years, ever since the Pentagon Papers, that administrations of both parties have only increased government secrecy in a variety of aspects. Right now, American society has very little trust in its government. Take away who's in charge in the White House, take away who's in charge in Congress. When you look at polls, do you trust the government institutions that are governing you? Those polls are at an all-time low, and a big reason is that they don't think that the American government is representing their interests, and that they are doing the opposite things behind closed doors that they say are going to do. And so one of the reasons, or one of the ways that we can support Americans across the political spectrum, is providing mechanisms of transparency that allow them to see exactly what their representatives are doing, allow them to see what the executive branch is doing, so that they can make better informed decisions when they go to the ballot box. The idea that the government should be more transparent is not a left idea. It's not a right idea. It's not a centrist idea. It's not a Democratic or Republican idea. It's an idea that if you were to poll it, probably polls at 80 to 90%. And so far from being a contentious issue, this should be an issue that everybody can agree on.
Absolutely. Transparency has a traditionally very strong bipartisan backing. I'd like to ask particularly Representative Tlaib and Robert Ellsberg, but anyone feel free to weigh in. What are the most important things the members of our audience can do to help support this bill going forward and to support Ellsberg's legacy?
I don't know if Robert, you wanted to go, but I think it's really important to understand that, our communities, our country, like I always tell people, mayors come and go, but the community stays intact, neighborhoods stay intact. No matter who is leading our country or who is in Congress, there are laws right now that are literally tools in a toolbox for folks that want to abuse it and misuse it. And so I think it's really important that it's not only the legacy of Ellsberg, but what actually happened to him and how unjust it was, and how now, literally we are in 2026 and still seeing Democratic, Republican presidents come in and misuse this to suppress real information that the American people desire. I'll tell you, more and more Americans are understanding this, especially the generation that's right behind me, and fully comprehending how dangerous it is to allow, again, this continued precedence of using this and abusing this in a way, especially in times of war that we see now, of getting information out. And again, for Ellsberg, it was about saving lives. It was about telling the truth so we can prevent, again, these abuse of powers and the corruption. And, for Republicans, Democrats, and this is something, Trevor talked about it, but I think warmongers and those that use their places of power positions and abuse it, this is exactly where they would go to try to push back against many of us out here, trying to make sure that, again, the best interest of the American people, the laws are being upheld. Those folks are the ones coming and misusing this and abusing this. And I think Republicans and Democrats agree, outside of Congress, though, that this is something that needs to change immediately. And again, no matter who is president. But Ellsberg grew up in Michigan. I like to say that and own that before Robert goes. And I know he grew up partly in his life in Detroit. And we birth movements here. We always speak truth, even if our voice shakes. And this is just part of our work that we continue to expose, again, the current processes and laws. A lot of people keep saying, why has this not been changed? Why is it still, again, being used over and over again to target people that are really out there to speak the truth? They're not spying on us all. They're just out there grabbing the information that those in power are trying to prevent the public from obtaining, and for them to make that decision. And again, I think it's important not only for his legacy, but really for our country to protect us against abuse of power and corruption.
Robert, would you like to add anything to that about what our audience can do to support your dad's legacy in addition to supporting the Ellsberg Act? I think he may be on mute.
I'd like to say that my father's case did kind of open up a crack that has become very important in the toolbox of successive administrations in going after dissenters and whistleblowers. And in a way, it remains a kind of an untested area of the law. He was not actually convicted, so it wasn't appealed and go to the Supreme Court. And many of those who've been charged because they couldn't defend themselves, entered into some kind of plea agreement, pleaded guilty, and went to prison in some cases. And so I'm not sure I would want to see this adjudicated by the current Supreme Court. I'm very glad. I think it'd be very important to introduce real clarity and boundary lines on the application of this law, the Espionage Act, and particularly because if not, if my father had been convicted, the next indictment would have been of the reporters and the newspapers who published the papers. That didn't happen, only because the case all fell apart. So that has been something that is a road we have not really fully gone down yet, but could very well happen. And I'm really grateful to Representative Tlaib for trying to head that off.
Agreed. Both Defending Rights in Dissent and FPF have tools that we're going to talk about briefly to help support the passage of the Ellsberg Act. Chip, Trevor, would either of you like to go first and talk about how folks listening can use those tools to help support the Ellsberg Act?
Sure. I think Nathan's going to, who's doing all the behind scenes work right now, is going to put a banner on the screen. But if you go to this URL, it will bring you the Defending Rights and Dissent website, and we will put you in touch with your member of Congress, and you can write to them right now today, telling them you want to protect the First Amendment, you want them to support this bill.
Yeah, absolutely. You can also go to freedom.press and just click Take Action. We have a way for people to easily contact Congress as well. What this bill needs next is going to be more co-sponsors. And so if you want your representative to support this bill, we have an easy way for you to get in touch.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody, to all of our guests today for joining. Representative Rashida Tlaib, Robert Ellsberg, Chip Gibbons, and Trevor Timm. Thank you for years of work fighting to reform the Espionage Act, as well as defending whistleblowers and journalists. It's certainly something, as we've talked a lot about at length today, that's now important, more so now than ever. And I'd also like to thank the members of the audience who joined us. If you'd like to learn more about Daniel Ellsberg, please visit ellsberg.net for more information, including about a new book that's coming out this week on Ellsberg called Truth and Consequences. And his son, Robert, wrote a foreword to that book. If you would like to learn more about FPF and other press freedom issues, please sign up for our newsletters at freedom.press/newsletters or visit us at freedom.press and pressfreedomtracker.us. If you'd like to tell your member of Congress to support the Ellsberg Act, as we mentioned, you can use either the DRAD tool or the FPF tool. And if you'd like to learn more about DRAD, please sign up for their newsletters and follow their ongoing coverage at rightsanddissent.org. To continue advocating for these journalists and issues that all journalists care about that you see here today and across the country, you can support the work that we do at FPF at freedom.press/donate, and you can support DRAD's work at secure.rightsanddissent.org. Thank you all so much for joining today.